So hello everybody, I am Anne Stevens and I'm one of the teachers on the course here. I will teach 3 of the seminars, well 2.5 actually, and Gary teaches all the rest. It's fantastic to see so many people and from all over the world. I love this part of teaching online that yeah, it's so international. It's really, really nice. I hope for the people that are up late at night or it's early morning that you're okay to be doing this. As always, we have cups of tea and we're sitting in front of the screen. So, you know, enjoy yourself and have a cup of tea while we're doing this. It's all very laid back, very relaxed, the way we run the course. We do ask sometimes to keep the pictures up just to keep us entertained as well, so we're not teaching to a wall of still pictures that nobody's moving to. So a little bit about me. I have been teaching this course since 2010, so this is my 11th, 12th year now. Before that, I am a physiotherapist and I have been for 26 years. I qualified in Denmark, which is where I'm from. And then I came over here when I had worked for 1 year in Denmark in my very early 30s. And I had my first job in the NHS in a public hospital for 3 years. And then I moved on to a private hospital for 4 years, then to a private clinic where I've been for the last 16, 17 years. I graduated from CTT, from Michael's school in 2004. As a craniosacral therapist, which is something I wanted to add to my physio, because I felt physio was very much, what's the problem, do something about it, sort it out and get people out the door. And I'm very much sort of the slow, gentle approach, get the body to sort it out, help people understand what's going on. So cranial worked really well for my kind of personality and how I wanted to work as a physio. And when I graduated, Michael asked me to come back and be part of the teaching team. So I did that for a couple of courses of students. And at the end of that, he asked me if I wanted to be an anatomy teacher, which I then agreed to. And I've done that ever since 2010. And I have taught the same 2-3 courses the whole way through. And I keep updating, keep putting new information in. I keep having to learn some of the stuff again because a year has gone past since I did it last time. So I teach the breath and blood, which is about the heart and the lungs and the circulatory system. I also teach about the digestive tract and how we metabolize. And then towards the end, I teach the first day of a weekend where I teach about the kidneys and the urogenital systems, so the bladder and productive organs. And that's what I do in the sort of bigger scheme of things. If I go on to do a little bit of my presentation, just so that you can see how I teach and what I share with people when I teach. I will do this here, share that. So it also gives you a sense of what happens when we teach the course. So this is the Living Anatomy course, of course, with Gary and I. We are going over 9 weekends. It's interactive. I break you up into small groups sometimes. We do experiences where we do things together, stand up, move, feel, touch. So as I said, I teach the breath and blood, the lungs, the heart and the circulatory system. And I teach the gut, how we metabolize, the digestive system, and the urogenital systems, the kidneys, bladder, and reproductive organs. I always like to start with a bit of embryology because it's important to know where does anything in the body come from. And very often things make more sense where you see how things are made or start out from right next to each other, and then they start to move, or they twist around, or they melt together. There's all these funny and interesting things that happens in the embryo that are astonishing and also very helpful in understanding the bigger anatomy later on. I like my anatomy. I always work with pictures of anatomy, cavities, membranes, related to other organs, where are things in relationship to each other. I'm a very 3D kind of person, and I'm very hands-on, so I like to know where things are. When you put your hands on the outside, you want to know what you're touching, what's just underneath your hands. It also makes it easier to understand how things in the digestive tract, for instance, how things move from one part to the next, to the next, to the next, if you can see how it runs and you have a sense of it in your own body as well. I also like to understand the physiology, at how are things actually working, what happens in the kidneys, what happens in the heart, what are the actual sort of, I don't like to use the word mechanical, but it's almost like it is mechanical. What happens where in the different organs, why does it happen, and what does it do for us? What is it we need to do? And very often I use videos, because some people have made some amazing videos that can explain things very quickly. They can take 30 pictures and you just get it in a movement in a video. But I do also like to take the time that it takes to piece things together and do it slowly, so that it starts to get ingrained in our brains and we understand it better. We usually start to relate what we're teaching with exercises, so that people get meditations, self-palpations, visualizations, just to embody the knowledge that you're getting, because that's very important. Now this is starting to, it's doing something. Right, it doesn't want to share. Let me just jump out. Okay. Let me do again. This happens sometimes on the Apple computers. You do something and then it stops being able to move. Very annoying. Share, here we go. Play again. Yeah, here we go again. So just a few little examples of the breath and blood seminar, the heart and the circulatory system. Big visuals of where things are, how things are related. You can see the heart, you can see the arteries and veins coming up to the heart. You can see how they spread out into the lungs. You can see where they are in relationship to the lungs and where it is in the body, so that you can get a good sense of where the chest, or where the heart lies in the chest. A more graphic example of it, here you can see the heart where it's lying. You can see the white stuff around the heart is the cardiac membrane that holds the heart in place, that holds it down close to the diaphragm. The lungs are being kept out to the side, the lung lobes, and you can now see how the heart is lying there in that its own little cavity. And if the lungs were let go, they would come down and flop slightly on top of, in front of the heart here. But you can see how it's really closely connected to the diaphragm, and how every time we breathe, that actually pulls the heart up and down, and also helps to make things flow around the heart. We go in depth with the blood. What is in the blood? These are little red blood cells that are lying against the epithelial, the inside of an artery. We look at red blood cells, white blood cells, the content of the blood, where is it made from, what else is in the blood, platelets, etc. So we go in depth with that. And we look at the whole system, how this whole closed system, where the blood from the heart gets pumped out into arteries all the way to the tips of our fingers and the tips of our toes. It gets returned up along the big veins, up into the heart. it goes out into the lungs, receives oxygen, expels CO2, and then the red blood cells go back to the heart again and start another journey that might take them up to the head or down to the opposite arm. But how that whole system circulates and travels, the blood vessels transports all the content of the blood in the circulatory system round, round, round. Your whole blood circulation is circulated every 2 minutes, I think it is. Everything has been around the body within 2 minutes, which is extraordinary. We will look in very much fine details of what the arteries and veins consist of, all the different levels of membranes, basement membrane, the different tunica, they're called, the different layers, the muscles. You can see the arteries and veins and nerves running along the arteries and veins. What implications does that have? The differences between arteries and veins, why there is differences, and how they are so well suited to bring blood around at high speed or at a slower speed when it comes back up to the body again. It's doing it again. So I think, yeah, let me just do a little bit here. Share screen again. Yeah, this is a real life capillary bed. This is the arteries at the very, very, very finest, thinnest size, where they go from being an artery actually to becoming a venule, a vein, and then returns back up to the heart again. But this is one, how the blood supply muscle fibers with blood. We're going to look at the lungs, where they are, where they sit, where we can touch them or not. We're going to look at the bronchs, where the trachea, where the air gets pulled into, and then how they jump across in the tiny little alveoli. The oxygen jumps across into the bloodstream and the CO2 jumps out. And we breathe that out when we breathe. Again, you can see the lungs are sitting on top of the diaphragm, and they also have a connective tissue that holds them onto the lungs. So when we breathe in and out, that actually helps us to suck air into the lungs. The digestive system, we're going to look at the whole tube, which is one long tube, literally from your mouth, through your esophagus, to the stomach, down the small intestines, wriggle, 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 over to the large intestines and out the anus. And we're going to look at what the gallbladder, the pancreas, and the liver help squirt into the duodenum, this first part of the small intestines, to see what do they do, how do they help breaking down our food, and why are they positioned where they are. This is a sort of very neat drawing of where everything is in connection to each other. Very, very intertwined and kept in places. Everything is kept in place by ligaments and membranes. We're going to look at some of these membranes. We're going to see how when you remove something and you go deeper and deeper in, what's behind all the way back to the back wall of the abdominal cavity, where you can see the kidneys, the little part of the duodenum, and the pancreas. And when we take that away, and we look around the other way, so when we turn the body and look forward, right in the middle of it, you've got the umbilicus, the belly button, and that's looking at the front of your stomach from behind. So I think I am nearly here. It's doing it again, and this is getting a bit tedious. Let's just see on this one. Yeah. I think I'll finish there. I'll also talk about the reproductive system. I'll talk about the kidneys, the bladder in that last day in seminar 8. But that's sort of a brief, quick run through of what I'm going to be teaching you over the 2.5 weekends that I'm teaching. So Gary, do you want to take over?
Yeah, thank you, Anne. It's always great to be involved in the course, and I also have the opportunity to be a student sometimes with it, because I sit in on Anne's sessions sometimes too, and it's always interesting to hear what Anne has to say and her perspective on things, and also from Anne's clinical experience too, and that's invaluable. And the way that the course has evolved itself, I really love working alongside Anne. I mean, she's been a great support to me within the work as well, but we kind of blend into each other's work with different rhythms, because we've both got very different teaching styles, and I think that's something that we really makes it work so well. Personally, for me, I come from a varied background, really. I started my life out as a personal trainer in the late 1980s, and I always had an interest in anatomy when I was much younger, because I got involved in competition cycling and also competition natural bodybuilding, so that's without the steroids. And there was always a sort of a keen interest of understanding the anatomy. And in fact, it was really important for what we were doing in the bodybuilding world to really understand the kinesiology, as it were, as it was known in those particular days, in terms of study of joints. But we know there's a lot more to that. And as life went on, I continued down the sort of deep interest of the body and looking at how it was functioning internally, but also what that meant in terms of life. You know, how does this thing that I live within, how will it sustain the way I continue into life? Because when we're young, it's nice to kind of keep training it and keeping it fit and have it look a certain way. But then there's that kind of switch over as to, well, that's kind of interesting, but am I going to be able to sustain this level of movement the way that I've got all the way through my life? And of course, that is something that's possible, but we also need to adapt as to how we go about that. Very briefly, I worked in graphic design, and I was working in 3D model making. So it's before these devices. It was all hands-on stuff, and using scalpels as well to make models and so on. And with 3D model making, we have to learn to see things in 3D a lot. And I found that that was kind of interesting for me, because when it came to training and working with other people that were training me, say within the movement world, is that I somehow had this ability to see what was going on from a 3D perspective. And jumping forwards then, as I sort of left the graphics world and I got involved in becoming a personal trainer professionally, it was just very easy for me to see how the movement patterns were occurring through someone's body, and understanding the anatomy that way was really kind of interesting. Also, alongside that, when I was actually training alongside bodybuilders that were professional bodybuilders, by the time they're getting themselves into competition condition, whether people agree with that sort of methodology or not, a lot of these guys, of course, were taking steroids. But what we would see is basically a moving anatomy map. And that was really quite interesting to see, because you could see every muscle fiber moving under the skin. So of course, if this guy is, say, training his biceps, for instance, what we would see is how the calves were responding to the movement of the bicep, because you could see every fiber within the system responding to load and movement and so on. And I found that really quite fascinating. So I realized, though, from being a movement teacher, as it were, I really wanted to get more manual and get hands-on. So I studied in shiatsu, traditional Chinese medicine. Along with that, I was also practicing in various martial arts, which I still do now. And the meridian systems were something that was kind of a big interest to me. But I realized also that when I was giving shiatsu treatments, something was happening under my hands that I couldn't quite describe to my teachers at that particular time. And it was only when I met one of my yoga teachers that was working a specific way with the yoga practice. And some of you, if you know of yoga or know of any teachers, there's a woman called Vanda Scaravelli who wrote a groundbreaking book in the late 1980s called Awakening the Spine. And she had a specific way of moving and understanding the practice that was very different to the way that we were understanding yoga in those days. And this individual was a man called John Sturck, who's an osteopath and a cranial osteopath. And he introduced the word fascia. connective tissues. And this was of interest to me. And I just thought, this is interesting. There's something happening that I'm beginning to realize in the way that I move. I'm feeling it a certain way, and it's kind of got a fluidy quality to it. And of course, when I then started to look into cranial work, I realized, what I was feeling under my fingers was something very different to the stuff that I was being told about when it came to the shiatsu. I was feeling something that had more of a rhythm to it. And that was of interest to me. And that led me down a specific route of working with people, understanding how they moved. And then from there, it led me on to meeting a man called Tom Myers. Some of you have heard of, and I know, Bobby, you would have heard of Tom. And I studied with Tom Myers in the late 90s. We were the first to bring him to the UK to run his then sort of unknown anatomy trainings, because there was no book in that time. And he was looking at how anatomy is connected, or muscular structures are connected in certain ways. And very simply put, they would be seen almost like a string of sausages in certain directions around the body, and then velcroed down at key points around the skeleton to bring a certain element of balance. His anatomy trains theory or model is not necessarily a model of movement, but it is an interesting body reading tool. And I used to then educate people in that work. I used to sort of co-teach with Tom in those early years and was involved in his first book, but then took a split from that because I started to see that there's a different way of exploring it. So from there, I was teaching anatomy courses endlessly and running my own sort of long-term anatomy courses, all based from a fascial focus. So what I bring to this, and when Michael made contact with me, is I think, and I hope, I'm looking at Michael now because he's at the top left-hand side of my screen, is that there was the interest in that connection with the fascial medium, because this is something that is the backdrop to everything that we explore when it comes to when we touch somebody's body, when we move it. So what I bring to, I think, the table or the course really is always blending it together again with what happens with the fascial network, so that how we can start to understand it from that perspective. So that there's a lot of experiential practices that go on, so that anyone that's coming into the course, really, whenever you get to the end of one of the weekends, there's specific home studies to start to explore, and there's a lot of experiential home studies. And it's very interesting to see what happens. And Anne and I were both saying this just recently, because one of the last courses had just come to an end, is that we see a transformation that happens with the students that come onto the course. And that was something that was a real surprise to me, because my courses that I run are in person. And I know that Michael has had this course in person for a long, long time, of which Anne's been involved in. But to bring it online, and Michael and I had this conversation originally, is that the dubiousness about bringing something online where we know there's a huge amount of people that can come from around the world, but can you do this? I can't touch you, but you can't touch me. But there's something that starts to happen once you start to learn about the system, once you start to learn about what you live in, and we get under the skin and you take yourself there. And that's a really interesting journey. And what we've noticed in the feedback from homeworks, from the self-practice homeworks, and then also the essay that comes up with it, is a level of transformation that we never expected to see come at it that way. And that's actually really moving. It's quite touching to see what happens. It was very sad to see that group go, because somehow through this medium, we found a way to connect. And interestingly, actually, the way that the world has been, and the way that we are all online, as much as these things feel separate, we're connected by the fact that we're doing this, that we have to do it this way, which I think it's quite a potent process. So what I'm going to do is go to my slideshow, and we're going to go into share. So I'm going to come to here. So of course, this is Anne and I, as we're going to the two main teachers on the course. But this is a quote that actually it's my quote. Sorry for putting this in there, it's my quote. I'm part of an organization called the Fascial Net Plastination Project. Some of you might have heard of this. And we've worked with the Body Worlds team. So Gunther von Hagens, if you've heard of him, of Body Worlds, creating the plastic looking bodies. And for the first time, we managed to create fascial plastinated pieces which were exhibited in Berlin in 2018 and at the World Fascia Congress. And what happened from there is we managed to get permission to go ahead with a full body, of which I was part of the lead dissecting team and designers, to generate a full body dissection, which was primarily fascial focused. And it was such a mind-blowing experience. And we've learned so much from that, that all of that information that I've learned from the form that we worked on has come into everything that I teach. In fact, the form that we've learned from, you know, I touch via her understanding now, which is quite incredible. But the thing that came up for us was this, is where do we start with a system that has no beginning and no end? Now, we know how it begins in terms of the sperm meeting the egg. But the one thing that we've ever seen in body worlds is that they can never take the body apart in the way that it came together. Because that means it's got to go backwards through time to be able to do that and take it back to the egg again. So there are thousands of ways that we can dissect the body and unravel it. But this was kind of interesting, is where were we going to start? Anyway, what we ended up with was this form called Freya. And Freya actually means fascia revealed, educating into the interconnected anatomy. That's the way that we changed the name, because initially it was the name Freya as in F-R-E-Y-A. But of course, body worlds could not have a name that relates to a person. So we managed to create an anagram of it. And in fact, it was Gil Headley, if you've heard of him, some of you, Bobby, I know you would have done, that came up actually with this title for her. And she's based in Berlin at the Berlin Body World. So Nia, I know you're in Berlin, pop along to Korperwelten in the center of Berlin, and you'll see there's a room dedicated to fascia for the first time in history, which is amazing. And Freya has got about 40 odd elements in her that are educational pieces. So anyway, moving on from there, I have image of the globe. Why do I have that? Well, really, when we're looking at a whole system, this is what our planet is. And whenever you've seen images of the planet from space, what you'll see is something that is the bluey color that it is, and then the varied colors that we see of land masses. Of course, those land masses are gray on there, but you know, we see these colored land masses in the bluey stuff. But what we don't see is the stuff that anatomizes it, which is this. And this is what the map gives us. So the map tells us where things are, gets broken up into country names. It has borders, it has states and counties and so on, and regions. The seas, which is kind of interesting here, each sea has got their own dividing name. But in fact, when you look at the entire globe, when I've flown over to what I've been teaching in Sweden just recently, and when I'm flying over the sea there, I don't see the Denmark Sea named. I don't see the English Channel written on the water. These fluids flow from one place to the next. So you've got this continuum. So when it comes to looking at something like this, and of course, this is not the whole picture, obviously. If we want the whole picture, then you've got skin over the top of that. But here from a wonderful anatomist called Vesalius created this illustration of what he called the muscle man. And the muscle man, what we see here is multiple directions. But you don't see independent names. Of course, there's a few letters on there because that's what he did with the illustration, and there were going to be names added to that. But here, you're just looking at a series of shapes that actually flow quite nicely together. But of course, what happens with this is it becomes regionalized, anatomized, and named. Now, this is the thing though. Here's Anne and I, and we're running this course, and we're teaching in terms of anatomy. And what we'll show you through the course as well, and I'll mention it now too, is that the word anatomy, anatomy, means to cut up. So it means to divide things up. And in fact, let me just come back to you while I'm doing this. I'm going to come off the screen share because I always do this when I teach. I want to come back and see you guys. Is that anatomy means to cut up. And what we're doing is when we start taking a scalpel to the skin, the moment we start to dissect, when we start to look at an anatomical structure, we've actually destroyed continuity from the very beginning. The moment we start to remove something, it's no longer whole. Does that make sense to everybody? Yeah, so the moment we start to unravel structures, we're beginning to create things based on the view of anatomy. Now, that view of anatomy is important to understand, but we must keep remembering that everything that we're looking at has come from something whole. So when it gets to dissecting, I can dissect a bicep and I can make a bicep. That's kind of interesting. I can definitely make a bicep, but the bicep isn't made on its own. The bicep is something that's continuous to everything around it. So we might look at certain regions like that, but what we'll look at is also where it's come from and where it's going to, because the bicep is part of a continuum, if that makes sense to everybody. So let me come back to the screen share. We were there. Okay, so coming back to this illustration here from Vesalius, once we start to shift our eyes and we start to see differently, we start to understand things maybe from a different perspective. And when I see this image, what we see when you look at this area on the front of the chest here, so most of you would probably know this, the pectoralis major, so this muscle, the pectoralis major on the left here, so your right, of course, on the screen, is what you can see here is how it kind of looks like a fabric folded round. And in fact, what we notice and what we find continuously in dissection labs is that this fabric, this material, this muscular and connective tissue material is actually continuous right the way around into the deltoid, so that the musculature of the shoulder. But what the anatomy book will show you is that there's a strong divide down here where you've got the division between the anterior deltoid towards the pectoralis. But in fact, they are one structure, just with a very deep fold. It's not a divide. So similar to the way that your clothing around your own shoulder might have a crease in it, that's pretty much what's happened in that tissue. And what that crease does is it permits motion. It allows structures to move against each other. And when we start looking at this with slightly different eyes, we see this particular direction. And what we see is continuous from the pectoralis round the deltoid and then through the outside edge of the arm. And in fact, then this connection buries itself deep into the forearm and then eventually becomes the tissues of the palm of the hand. So in fact, again, if I come off the share, I come back to you. You bring your hand onto your chest, please, for me. Let's make sure everyone's done that. Okay, looks like you're about to swear an oath to me or something like that. This is the anatomy oath. So that from here, what we're going to do is we're going to come around from the breastbone, from the chest, and then over onto the deltoid. And if you lift the arm up and then move it forward slightly and bring your fingertips towards this sort of crease in this region, that there's definitely a divide, there's a fold in that region where you've got gliding processes. But in fact, then if you let the hand come over to the outside, what you've then got, if you can find your tricep, the back of the upper arm and the front of the upper arm, the bicep, once you start to feel around the deltoid, you can feel, some of you, is that the outer part of your shoulder comes down to a point. In fact, I've got something I can use here. I live in Brighton by the sea. Seashells, there's a deltoid. It's pretty much that shape. And in fact, interestingly, this is a pectoralis major as well. It's pretty much that shape. And what we start to see is that in these particular regions, you've got these similar kind of shapes. In fact, it's this way around. So when you come around your deltoid, you'll get to a place at the bottom of the deltoid and there's a pointy bit. Everyone notice that? Some of you? If you lift the arm up slightly, you'll feel how the muscle becomes a bit tougher because it's lifting the weight of the limb. And now, if you can strum your fingers from side to side, I know the Rolfers will love this as they go down. And then we strum from side to side, sorry, Bobby, we'll go down. And then you meet that space between the tricep and the bicep. And that takes you down towards the forearm. And if you find this tissue on the upper part of the forearm here, called the brachialis, if you follow that round, I don't know if you can see it on my arm, you can almost see a twist there. It actually then delves deep. And then you can end up into the hand. You can't take your fingers in there. I wouldn't suggest taking your fingers into this area. because you'd need to go very deep until you get to the palm of the hand. But basically from your breastbone, via your chest and your deltoid, via the outside of the arm to the inside of the forearm, you're connected to the palm of the hand. Does that make sense? So these are very interesting connections. And for me as a manual therapist, and also how we start to experience this with the groups online, is what are they doing with their hands, and what kind of tension do they bring into the hand? What effect does that tension from the hand have on the chest? Because we see quite regularly, this commonly shortens. So maybe, as a suggestion, it might have something to do with what we start doing with the forearm and the hand as an idea. Now, the other aspect to this, let me just come back to the screen share. Nia, and I know you had your hand up, but we'll get to you a little bit later, okay? So let me come back to here. If I'm following how the tissue flows from one place to the next, what we also understand is that lower portion of the pectoralis major, and if you look at fibers here, you see the direction in the illustration, they actually point towards this area here. So see, what the anatomy and the drawings will give us are dividing lines, but there is no dividing line. If you remember the quote at the beginning, where do we start with a system that has no beginning or end? If I go from the pectoralis downwards, what this tissue does is it actually becomes continuous to this area here called the rectus abdominis, so the six-pack abdominal muscles, and that then takes you down to the pubic bone. So now, if I come back to you, here takes us up through the center of the forearm, towards the outside edge of the forearm, outer part of the upper arm, onto the deltoid, round onto the pectoralis, and then from the lower portion here of the pectoralis, and if you can find the outer edge of your chest here, that outer edge of the chest muscle starts to travel downwards, and if you follow that down, have your pubic bone in your sights, that's exactly where you're heading to. And we've dissected these things following those particular pathways. And it's what we try to call honest dissection. So we let the tissue take us where it wants to go. Now, the interest for me, especially when it comes to movement, and also teaching to the groups that we have with this living anatomy course, is can we allow ourselves to go with those patterns rather than go against them? And the woman, Vanda Scaravelli, that created the book Awakening the Spine, had a quote or a saying that used to say, going with the body and not against it. Because see, when we go against it, is usually where we end up in trouble. It's where we start to see injuries occur. Everything that you have just under your skin is a landscape. And it's a beautiful landscape of shape. Not only that, it's a beautiful landscape of shape, but it's also a landscape that has the ability to feel itself. So a lot of that sensation is unconscious. This is where we see within certain cranial practices where we allow the tissues to start to go where they need to go. The body starts to find patterns to unwind, and it will do it not against itself, but following its patterns and shapes. And these are some of the differences that we start to get in terms of feedback from the students that have done the course. Is that by being able to learn about what they've got under their own skin, by interacting with it that way, they've actually allowed themselves to almost liberate the way that they move. It's helped them in the practices that they already have, whether they go on to train in cranial sacral work through Michael's training or not. It makes a big difference. Let's move on from there. So, I love this quote. Let me just come on to this. This is from Leonardo da Vinci. And I keep coming back to this every time. I use this as much as I can. I've been using this quote as almost a mantra, really, through most of my teaching life, is learn how to see, is realize that everything connects to everything else. And Da Vinci wasn't necessarily just talking about this in terms of the body. He was also talking about this in terms of nature, how everything interacts with nature, how that nature interacts with us, and then also how our networks interact with each other. We hear of the word systems, nervous system, cardiovascular system. I don't usually, we know those words systems exist and they're existent in your anatomy books, but really what we're looking at are networks. They're integrating networks, and how do they all work with each other? But then how does us as an integrated network then interact with the rest of its environment and each other? Probably even more important right now in this day and age than ever before. And then gravity. This is a quote from Steve Paxton, who he wrote a very small little book, it's a sort of a pocket-sized book called Gravity. Steve Paxton, if you've never heard of him, is an Aikido practitioner, master, and also a dancer and performer, or was, in the world of what's known as contact improvisation. And contact improvisation brings about these elements of Aikido as to how people roll. So sorry, I'm just going to come off the screen and come back to you again. This is how I work, so I keep going back and forth. So Steve Paxton has educated a lot of people in a movement system called contact improvisation, where two bodies meet and then they roll with each other, and they practice those methods and ideas. It's born out of the qualities of Aikido, but it's translated itself beautifully into dance. And it's a very expressive way of working. But the key element behind any of that work is the basis of gravity. We're gravity beings. We can't exist without it. Our system is shaped by the force of gravity. And we look at gravity at certain points in the course, and we actually challenge what it might be, because there are considerations that gravity obviously is a pulling force, but there's another side to that where gravity is being considered a pushing force. I'm going to leave that there because that's a big description, but we start to explore those two ideas and start to explore moving from that perspective as well. But gravity plays a huge effect on the balance of our system. You've heard, well, in fact, there's an English astronaut, I don't know if you've heard of him, a man called Tim Peake. I don't know if anyone's heard of him. And he went up to the International Space Station, and his job going up there was to look at organizing different training systems, fitness systems for astronauts. So, it would be great. I could go up into space and take one of these along with me, and I could probably lift 1,000 pounds or 10,000 kilos and just keep doing this all day long, because there would be no gravity. So what happens in space is that after a while, the body atrophies, the system breaks down a little, bones lose their density, muscle mass diminishes. So it would be useless for me to take a weight up there, because I could appear like the strongest man in the world, but nothing's going to happen to my body. So what he was doing was finding ways to attach springs, like Pilates springs, to the structure so that they've got some resistance to pull against. And the reason for him doing that is that what NASA has in their sights is actually sending a manned mission to Mars. That's what they want to do. That will happen at some point. But it's going to be useless to the human form if they get to Mars and the body's atrophied along the way. Because by the time they get onto the surface of Mars, it's unlikely they'll have the strength to hold themselves up. So we need to make sure that the species traveling to that planet is a strong enough species to deal with it. Does that make sense? Oh, somebody's got their phone on. That's not for me. There we go. I'll just turn that off. Does that make sense to everybody? And in fact, should there be earthbound humans that then go to Mars and then reproduce on Mars, that individual born on Mars is no longer earthling. And their system will adapt itself to the Martian gravity. So it's unlikely to be able to survive living on an Earth gravity. In fact, there's been a movie made about that. And that movie is following NASA science. So we are absolutely shaped by the force that we grow from, because we are born of the Earth. We've grown from it. But we are probably the only species on the planet that behaves as if we're separate from it. Okay, so from that perspective, let's just move on. So, gravity. How does this structure deal with gravity well? And what we start to look at, and again, I know Bobby would know this stuff, is that the bony structures aren't something that can do this. We've never come across in archaeological digs, they've never found anything standing. In archaeological digs, they always find that the bones are separate and they're on the ground. The one thing that we absolutely know about the skeleton is that the bones don't touch. There's a space between each bone at the joints that we call synovial joints, where you've got a moving joint with fluid between it. So this structure is suspended, and through the course, we look at that in quite a lot of detail as to how that happens. And as we get into different regions of the body, we keep coming back to it over and over again from different angles and different perspectives. Here is something dealing with gravity beautifully. And in fact, when we look at this, we've got this possible notion that maybe gravity is something that's pushing. His body weight is resting against something that has almost this impression, impression that it's pushing upwards. And you can see that, in fact, he's quite relaxed. Now, relaxation is considered to be an intense state of alertness. Relaxation isn't what, I'm going to come back to you because I need to do this to face. Relaxation isn't what teenagers do. Teenagers drop into that collapse. That's what we call collapsation. You know, those of you who've got kids, teenagers, you kind of know what that's like. Collapsation actually costs energy. So when we collapse, for me to be able to get to a place where I can get to somewhere where I can start to move again, I've got to get from collapse, which is almost negative, to zero to get to positive to move. Does that make sense? So it's cost me energy to get moving. But relaxation is a place where we can go from zero to something and back again. So if you can remember the image of the leopard resting on the branch, in fact, I'll go back to him now and I'll talk you through this, because when we see him on the branch, it's the eyes that I'm interested in. Because you can see when you look at his eyes, is that he's very alert. If I was to walk underneath that branch with a piece of meat over my shoulder, he would be off that branch in an instant and onto my shoulder or something. He wouldn't have to wait to get himself up. He would be able to move from 0 to 100 and then back to 0 again. I asked Anne at the very beginning of the session, are we ready now to get going? Anne said, I'm born ready. Is that the structure here is something that's born ready. We're born ready. So let's come off that. Come back to you. How are we doing with this so far? Is this making sense? So from our ability to respond well to gravity, can we move from gravity towards something and then back again? And can we understand how these structures interact with each other from a gravitational perspective? So, Anne, can you do some mute hunting for me? Okay, I'm going to go back to the screen share. And let's come back to here. So something that we also start to explore, and this is based around gravity once again, is that this is something that we know of animals, that they move easily between sort of relaxed states and alert states and hypervigilance. And they can do that from one moment to the next. And a big element of that is how we meet the ground, how the system can relax to the ground. And what we start to see here is where an element of safety comes from that. And something that we start to look at into the course, which there was a big element of this on the last course that we've just explored, is stress patterns. So where the body moves towards what's known as fight or flight, or rest and relaxation. And whenever you see animals, cats especially, you see them go from a heightened state of arousal and they can diffuse it really quickly, and back to a heightened state of arousal and they can diffuse it really quickly. You know, where do we get our ability to diffuse from? If I come back to you. So what we notice with humans is that they can maintain and move towards a stress state, but quite often we don't see them diffuse it very well. And in fact, in standing, one area that I see happen a lot in standing and trying to hold the body up is that you see a lot of people hold their body up from their neck and their shoulders. And you'll see this a lot. The amount of effort it takes to hold yourself up with your neck. If you try picking someone up by their neck, sorry, don't try that. But if you ever tried picking someone up by their neck or their shoulders, that's an enormous amount of effort. Not that I do that, by the way, but the effort that it takes, that's a lot of energy required to do that. If we can allow ourselves to settle to the ground well, then the structures above have got a chance to relax, and we can then dissipate any charge that we hold on to back to the earth again. We know this in structural bodywork. And I'm looking at Bobby again now because he's a fellow structure integration practitioner. Where we align the body well within gravity, excess effort is taken away. You can see, I don't know if you can see just about there. Well, that was good. That was accurate pointing. Right behind me is what's known as a tensegrity toy. Is that about right, Anne? Can you see it there? Am I touching it? Yeah, good. So it's taken me years to practice that. But there's a tensegrity toy there, and basically it's a bunch of wooden structures with elastics suspending it and holding it open. And it's actually got an evenness of tone to it. So it's kind of got a relaxed state, not a collapsed state. So when we're in a relaxed state, the body has an evenness of tone all the way around it. And that potential is available to pretty much everyone. That's the potential, by the way. That requires educating sometimes. That requires feeling. Can we first of all feel where we put stress? What's your own specific pattern? Does anyone know how much this weighs? Roughly. Let's see a few heads going to go in one day. On average, well, I've got this here.
Same as a bowling ball?
Yeah, same as a bowling ball. So a bowling ball is about 4, because what size bowling ball? That's the thing. Yeah, I've got a big bowling ball, but sometimes it's empty. Sorry, Michael. So, but here I've got a 5 kilo weight. So what's that? That's probably about 10 or 11 pounds. And that's quite a bit of weight, right? Sorry about how this is going to hit. My wife's just gone out as well because she's teaching somewhere. So I can do this. That's loud. So that leaves a dent on the floor. Right, that's pretty much how much the head weighs. On average, 14 pounds is a big, heavy head, by the way. So maybe 11 pounds, 5 kilos is on average. You can see with this, it's got a hole in the middle. So, of course, if I put my finger through that, what I can do with this is put that above my head. That would be so funny if I dropped it on my head. So, well, it probably wouldn't be. So I can keep that weight directly above the head. So I can move around with that weight, and it doesn't cause me too much effort to keep it here because I've arranged myself in gravity. But the moment I start taking it over here, now I'm beginning to feel something. Now I'm feeling it just at the base of my neck. Now I'm beginning to feel it in the deltoid. Oh, now I can feel it through the forearm, and now the finger's beginning to wobble a little bit. So it's time for me to bring that down. But quite often we'll see the weight of the head taken forwards of the body weight, taken forwards of the ribs, taken forwards of the pelvis. And all of those local tensions start to build up. And just like I showed you, the hole in the center, look what Mother Nature gave us. Did exactly the same thing. Put the hole in the middle. So what the spine does is it comes and meets it directly underneath. So ideally, what the head would do is to sit above the center of the pelvis. Now, we've just lived through about 2.5 years of this happening, putting the face right up against the screen. Head forwards position. So that head forwards position is sending this structure forwards. Back of the neck, shoulder girdle, front of the chest, all of these areas start to shorten. Now, along with the weight of this, there's an interesting structure, because I'm sort of talking about the stress element here, is that this thing, the jaw. So the mandible, jaw, with the tongue, with the musculature that makes up the floor of the jaw, and the musculature that makes up this part of the skull here. So this is called the temporalis muscle. In fact, if you do this for me, if you bring your fingertips just around, I have my hair shaved especially for this, right? So you bring your fingertips around the top of the ears and then bite your back teeth together. Can you feel a muscle flickering there under your fingertips? Some of you noticed that? So that's called the temporalis muscle. And it's a big muscle. And guess what? In fact, it's that shape. But that's kind of interesting. It's got no relationship to your pectoralis major, but it's interesting that it's that shape. And then if you put your fingers between the cheekbone and the corner of the jaw here, so almost between your back teeth, and bite down. And notice how hard that muscle goes here. So this is called the masseter. So you've got temporalis and the masseter all gathering at this point at the side of the jaw. When you go into cranial trainings, you would learn a lot more about this in a lot more depth. But these two areas have the biting power, and I'll do this in English pounds, I don't know what the translation is in kilos, of up to 500 pounds of pressure per square inch. Which means that if I could open my jaw wide enough and put a walnut between my back teeth, I'll be able to crack it. That's a lot of power. And where we've taken the, oh look, I can do this with this. I've never done that before. There you go, look, brand new on screen, first time ever. Temporalis attached to the mandible. We'd have the same the other side with the tongue, and we had the floor of the jaw, and we've weighed that in a lab. And the maximum weight from a very large jaw and head was 2 kilos. On average, it's about 1.25 kilos. So if I gave you all 1.25 kilos weight and asked you to hold it in front of you for the rest of the day or the evening, or whatever time it is in your country, so for the next 4 hours, you'd find that your arm and your neck would start aching by holding it in front of you. Because that's collective load over a prolonged period of time, gathering muscular effort and force. Not only that, fascial effort and force, because it's all intertwined. Does this make sense? What's happening to your skull where it meets the spine when the jaw maintains that level of bite or contraction? Because what do you do with the jaw when you're tense? Do it for me, please. Usually not. Exactly, Bobby. Yeah. So binding down. So what I'm doing then is kind of screwing the skull onto the spine and maintaining that tension. So what it's doing to the body is just telling the body that it's moving towards fight or flight. Yeah. Ark, I've just seen Ark with his dog right now. And when my dog was alive, I used to sort of pat the dog underneath the jaw. And when I did that, I could hear her teeth bang together. And I did it a couple of times because I was astounded that that happened. But her lips were touching. But when I banged the jaw was loose. And I realized, of course, she's not tense in the jaw, never. Animals aren't tense in the jaw. They keep it relaxed. Humans are probably one of the only species that keeps it tight and tense. I'm beginning to see some jaw slacking already on the screen right now. Yeah. So can we allow that structure just to start to drop a little bit? Maybe that gives us a chance to organize where the head is relative to the pelvis. Maybe it gives us this ability to realize exactly what we're doing with our neck. Gorillas, by the way, their temporalis, just as an aside, their temporalis comes right to the top. And you usually see on a gorilla skull a big ridge down the center. The gorilla skull, or temporalis and jaw, has the biting power of a ton per square inch. Exactly, Bobby. Yeah. Even your computer wobbled then, Bobby, when I said that. It means that they've got the ability to bite through bone if they needed to. So they've got a much smaller brain case, and our brain case got bigger. So what we did is we chose the brain over brawn. So our temporalis has done what my hair did. It kind of went down to the sides a bit more. Yeah. Okay, let's move on from there. So, so areas that maybe have to deal with that level of stress. So if we kind of look at this from there's a physical stress that happens in terms of the patterning, but also there becomes a postural stress as well. Or there's an emotional stress from the patterning with the jaw sometimes, and then there becomes a physical stress, and that physical stress can go into other areas of structure. And this is one such area really that I'd like to maybe look at here, is how the ribs and the spine meet. And it's a very beautiful set of connections. And what we know of the rib structure is that classically it gets called a cage, especially in the Western world. When we're in Germany, if I'm teaching in Germany, also I've taught in Austria many times, is that they don't call it a cage. The ribs are known as a basket. And when you look at this, especially when you're looking at the rib structure from the back, you can see the muscles between the ribs called the intercostals. And they have a kind of a crisscross basket weave kind of arrangement to them, which means that the ribs are actually much more flexible than the idea of them being a cage. So they've got a pliable structure. You could grab hold of the ribs like holding a basket and then twist them, and then they would spring back once again. But where the ribs meet the spine, there's multiple joints where the ribs meet the spine. And you can see, when you see the image here, you can see the vertebral structures, you can see a long ligament that runs along the length of the spine, and then you can see all sorts of different connective tissues here that are outlined in the white or grayish kind of look there, that are kind of relating to the joint capsules where the ribs meet the spine. And there's a joint there that's movable with fluid between it, just like the kind of joint you would see at the knee or the hip, but not as big. But it's very well organized with lots of connective tissue to keep it firmly in place, but to allow for movement. But it also allows for rotation. And something that goes missing, I see a lot really, is missing in everyday life, especially within the Western culture, is the ability to rotate. The ability to rotate the rib structure, the ability to rotate the thoracic spine. It's built for rotation. Can we allow it to rotate? But in here is, as Anne was talking about earlier, is your respiratory structure. And there is no space. Let's see if I've got the next image up. Yeah, there is no space between the lungs and the ribs. There's a lining, there's a membrane there. So the strong fascial linings that exist in that area called the pleura enable a glide. So where the lungs fill up that space, they're touching the surfaces and then they glide with each other. What we see when we look at this is a huge cavity in the front of the body. and that cavity is divided by the diaphragm, of which Anne goes into in quite some depth. We also look at the balance and the structure of the diaphragm. And in fact, Anne, whilst you're here, and now we're in this area, would you like to just go into that lateral breath practice? So I'll come off.
Yeah, that's a good time to do it. Actually, could you put the picture up with the ribs, the one before you just had now?
I can definitely do that. So
that's a really good picture.
Yeah, so let me go back to that, and then I'll go back one. There you go.
That's it. Perfect. Perfect. Yeah, I just want to do a little exercise with you that we're going to do again when we do the lungs and talk about the rib cage and the membranes and everything up there. As you can see, where the ribs touch into the spine, can you see my cursor? Yeah, you're doing it. Okay. Yeah, so where the ribs attach onto the spine, there's 12 ribs on either side. That's 24 little joints that should move when we breathe in and out, and the ribs move ever so slightly with every breath. So that little pump, when we sit slouched, if we sit still for too long, if we sit and compress the whole chest, doesn't move. We have lost lots of little pumps that helps to bring blood in and out along the spine, lymph that needs to be pumped away or in from there, and cerebrospinal fluid. So we produce cerebrospinal fluid in the brain all day, and it runs down in the spinal canal and slowly drifts out along with the nerves out into the body. And all of that movement of fluid happens much better if we breathe properly. So I just wanted to first slump down, slouch, let your head come forward, let your shoulders drop forward, and try to take a deep breath in and get a sense of how much air can you get into your lungs when you are sitting like this. Do a couple of breaths so you get a good sense of how big is your chest. And now I'd like you to sit up, lift your chest up, not sticking it out, but just lifting your chest up. Draw your shoulders back, let your shoulder blades fall backwards rather than forwards. Stick your head on top of your spine. Imagine you're sitting in a car and you want to touch the back of your head to the headrest in the car, but still keeping your eyes on the road in front of you. So that has sort of aligned the cervical spine, the thoracic spine, and your shoulders, balanced everything on top of each other. Then I would like you to, if you can, and if you can't, then move to somewhere else. Get your hands up. I can feel my lower rib cage here, and I want you to have your little finger on the lower and then higher up if you can. And have your fingers just slightly spread out and slightly to the back. You don't want it to be too far forwards, back as well. So more on the side of your rib cage on either side there. So I'll just demonstrate with my hands with you here. So sitting upright as much as you can without a lot of tension in your body, but just sort of float in that middle stage. Have your hands on your rib cage. And then if you imagine your ribs, they're attached to the back and they're attached to the front like bucket handles. When you're in a relaxed state, they're sort of down a little bit. Can I get you to try to take a breath in where your hands are and lift those bucket handles out to the side? So you're breathing sideways out into your rib cage, and feel with your hands how your rib cage expands side to side, and then slowly let it come back down. And as it goes down, just squeeze a little bit with your hands or squeeze with your ribs if you can make them do some work, and then release, and then continue into a filling up your lungs sideways, also front to back. Actually, you can imagine your whole rib cage like a balloon. It expands side to side, front to back, downwards, up, everywhere. And like a balloon, as the air goes out, the whole balloon deflates slightly. So again, breathe sideways, expand your lungs, lift your ribs up, and that takes a bit of energy. And then there's a recoil as they just float back down again. And then there's an extra bit of energy used to squeeze the ribs. And then as you release, they bounce back up again, they recoil back up again. And then now just release and just breathe normally and just feel, can you feel those ribs now move that little bit more without you paying attention to them, without you making them do something? When you do that, when you engage your ribs, you get the intercostals to lift the ribs up, inviting those little pumps to happen every breath you take in and out, all along the spine from T1 to T12. It lifts the lungs, it moves the heart, it helps the digestive system, it helps to return blood back up into your body again because your diaphragm is pumping up and down at the same time. It's all about pressure and under pressure to help the circulation blood back to the heart and to help the circulation along the spine, blood going in and out, lymph and cerebrospinal fluid as well. In physio and in Pilates, you call it lateral breathing, that you get the ribs sideways as well. There's many different ways of doing it, but I like to do this one. And I often teach that to people when I have them on the table doing craniosacral therapy, and I can see there's absolutely no movement in that chest. Maybe the stomach comes out and get up and down, so they do the diaphragmatic breathing, but very often it's up here, it's shallow breathing, and that's more the accessory muscles. But if you can get the rib cage to move and expand and start to come in and out, if you do that and you get people to do it and they relax into it, you can literally feel a physical difference in your hands. If you have one underneath the cervical spine and one underneath the lumbar spine, the flow up and down the spine changes when you have your hands there. And if you ask people to try and remember to do that, especially when they're working, but also maybe before you go to sleep, to just connect to those muscles and allow a slow, gentle breath to feel the whole rib cage without a huge amount of work happening, it relaxes you. It helps to just get flow everywhere. So it's a nice little thing to do. Sit back, hands on ribs, takes a couple of deep breaths, and then let it happen by itself. So yeah, somebody's commenting that they do breath work. So I'm sure there's people that have lots more exercises. There's just a simple explanation to how the lateral, the intercostals are working and how to help get some flow in there. It's really great to see so many different people from so many different types of body work, everybody bringing stuff in. So do you want to come back in again?
Yes, that's fine. Thank you. Thank you, Anne. So I'm going to just stop the share for a moment. I'm going to come back to my screen in a sec. Hang on. So let me do that with you now. Thank you, Anne. Perfectly blended. So, and as Anne was saying, and what we'll look at here briefly, is that we've got this area that's connected from ribs to spine, and our breath mechanism, as you can see here, is that space where the lungs would be, which is above the diaphragm, but also the abdomen is involved in the process of breathing. If I just go back to that image before, we can see these muscular structures that run off the top of the ribs to the side of the neck. These muscles are called the scalenes. And if we just look at it from this perspective, when we just shift our eyes a moment, what we can see really is that the ribs are hanging from the neck. There's a consideration that the lungs hang from the neck via their fascia, and that's something that we look at when we get into that particular region of the neck. But also, the spine itself is part of your breathing mechanism. And this kind of crosses over. This is where a lot of the stuff that Anne and I do when Anne's running one session and I go into the spinal session, these two things interface, because when we're talking about the spine, we're talking about the breath. When you're talking about the breath, you're talking about the spine. And you can just see here, just with these schematics, is where you can see the ribs here And then what there is missing from this particular area at the bottom is the joint capsule. They've cut an opening in the illustration here. You can see my cursor sort of circling that area. Is that the ribs through the thoracic spine, through a specific region of the thoracic spine, interface with the discs. So that when you're breathing, I'm just going to come back to you. So I'll get back that image back up again in a moment, but let me just come off the share and I'll come back to you. So where the ribs meet the spine, they sit between two vertebrae. And when you're breathing, the ribs are doing this. So sorry about what I'm going to do right now. If my face is a disc, here's the ribs. As the ribs are moving, it's difficult to do that and breathe and talk at the same time. But as the ribs are moving up and down with the breath, the discs are being moved as well. When I'm rotating, those ribs are moving slightly with rotation, so the disc is being stimulated as well. Does that make sense to everyone? So movement and breath working together are both stimulating the disc material. The breath alone, if we're well balanced in gravity, so it kind of comes back to that again, because as Anne did at the very beginning of this segment just then, is that if you're collapsed and you're trying to breathe, there isn't much breath moving to the spine anymore. The spine's no longer part of the breath mechanism, and then we have to gain access to breath another way. And quite often we see that the neck tries to do a little bit too much, or the abdomen has to expand a lot more to try to assist in the breath coming in. But when we understand where we are relative to gravity, keep looking at Bobby because I know where this goes. When we start to sort of come and arrange ourselves within gravity, is that there's much more freedom for everything that Anne was describing. And the spine is something that then is able to undulate. So the spine isn't a fixed unit. So let's go back to that. Where were we? We were here. So there's a lot of connective tissue, lots of fascial type structures that are binding the ribs to the spine, that's binding the joint capsules to around the disc, that binds the vertebra to vertebra, but also permits motion one way or the other. And it's tensioned in all sorts of different degrees, or to different degrees. Here, we've got a couple of examples of what happens to the connective tissue under certain stresses. And we'll look into this again when we go into the course and we go into it in a bit more depth as to exactly how and why this starts to happen, and also the physiology behind it. But what you've got, the image on the left of your screen, is quite a lot of space within that tissue. And these are the fibers of the connective tissues, the fascial fibers of a region of the body that had the limb broken, not on purpose. It was an accident, but at the same time as this individual was going into surgery to have that area repaired, they were also doing a research at that time on what the connective tissues look like at a certain state. So a camera went in to photograph this particular region, and then the image to the right of your screen is the same area 6 to 8 weeks after that region of the body came out of a plaster cast. And what you can see is that the spaciousness of the fiber has actually matted together. And in the language that we use in fascial anatomy is called densified. So it's densified tissue. And what happens with densified tissue is it prevents motion from happening. The other thing, let me just come away from that, come back to you, is that whenever a limb has gone into a plaster cast, let's say the arm's gone into a plaster cast because the arm was broken, and there it is in a plaster cast and a sling, what you would see 6 to 8 weeks, in fact, even after 2 weeks, if that arm came out of a plaster cast after 2 weeks, you would see the arm is visibly smaller. If anyone's ever broken something or had a limb in the plaster cast, you'd realize how small the limb gets. And what happens is that the muscular tissue atrophies, just like the astronaut. because it's not being used. But what the body does is when you get atrophied muscular tissue, the body lays down more collagen. So where it lays down more collagen, it starts to stabilize the structure, but it makes it much stiffer. It's less able to respond. And in fact, this is something that happens in the, I don't like to use this word, but I'm going to use it, the aging process. Now, there's a good friend of mine from Stockholm, actually, who's a movement teacher. And he says, I don't call it aging. I call it going through levels. So I'm level 59 right now, which means I must be at a really advanced level. Hopefully, I don't get told that often. Rather than 59 years of age, I'm 59th level. It kind of sounds better. But anyway, as we start to move through the ages, and this is going on, say, with my father's 84, and he's a masters athlete, and he's a hurdler at 84. Not only that, at 84, he runs a 100-meter sprint in 16 seconds. My brother and I have a tough time keeping up with him. But he keeps working with mobility. He keeps working with using some resistance work. So he's maintaining a degree of muscle mass, but he's noticing, even though he's doing that, that there is a slight decline, but not as fast as his contemporaries or his friends, because he's maintaining the work and he's still able to get over hurdles, which is quite something.
I remember there's two pieces of research that I remember from when I studied with physiotherapy, and we had a very young teacher, and they didn't have, the ethics and ethic committees and all of that in those days. But they had one piece of research where they took 25-year-old young men and put them in bed for 2 weeks. No disease, no nothing, just put them in bed for 2 weeks. And they did, what's it called when you take like a core sample into the muscle tissue?
Oh, biopsy.
Biopsies. They did biopsies before and after. And those young men lost 25% of their muscle mass from lying still, no disease, no problems, no nothing, and they were young and healthy. So 2 weeks in bed, 25%.
That's quite profound.
It is quite profound. And the other thing that they did was they did the same muscle biopsies on people in their 80s and trained them and exercised and got them really to pick up. And they proved that people up into their 86th year, at least, that was the oldest contestant they had, improved their muscle mass with exercises.
Yeah.
So we can work harder than the decline is, and you will gain.
Yeah.
But I think lockdown has done a massive disservice to lots and lots and lots of people.
I think so, yeah. I mean, there's an interesting dynamic with that as well, isn't there, Anne? Because what we find is that there's an amount of people that have actually stayed put during lockdown and stayed sitting down, but also lockdown has motivated people to get moving as well.
Yeah, that's true.
There's a lot more teaching that's gone online. The only difference, and I know you know this, is that the thing that has happened is that the people that used to get up in the morning, I'm going to do the classic thing. London is about 90 miles up the road. I live in Brighton. People commute from Brighton to London to work. So what they would do is they would get up, have their breakfast, walk to the station, the train station, then get on the train, sit on the train, get to London, either walk through the tubes or walk through London or jump on a bus and so on, get to work. But at least they're moving. Now they're rolling out of bed and rolling in front of their computer.
Yeah.
So the process of movement that's loading the body efficiently is not happening. That bit's going missing.
One of my patients said he used to do 10,000 steps, just sort of gone midday in his old job. And now he's lucky if he does 2,000 at home in a whole day.
Yes, exactly. There was actually a lovely story about a woman that's an elderly woman. So she was level 98 and she was interviewed on TV. And she wasn't. She was level 100. That's right, because this is the important thing about it. And they said, "What's your secret?" And she said, "Dark chocolate." And the interviewer said, "What do you mean?" She said, "I love to sit down on my armchair and watch the specific program on TV, but I like my dark chocolate. So I keep it in the fridge. And the fridge is two doors down that way. So I get up, go to the fridge, break off one square of dark chocolate, walk back to the chair, eat it, When I feel like another piece, I get up, I walk to the fridge, break off another square. So it's the fact she's getting up and down and going to the fridge rather than I'm going to take the whole bar and sit at the chair with it. You know, something as simple as that is the thing that's keeping her moving and just loading her body the right way. She's probably still losing some muscle mass with the natural decline, but she's keeping active. So coming back to actually the thing that just quickly with the lockdown thing with my dad, because he still runs his own business with my brother. And during lockdown, of course, he couldn't go to the running track to do his training. And he's got a tiny factory unit on a farm near Cambridge in the UK here. So what the farmer did was leveled part of an orchard and helped my dad mark out a quarter of a running track. And my dad made some plastic hurdles and was always able to train all the way through lockdown. It's genius. You know, this is someone that's just not letting it get to them. Just what I'm just going to keep finding a way because I want to, you know, compete in the next couple of years when we figure out that maybe lockdown ends. So, you know, maintaining the movement through the body is at least preventing densification and extra collagen laydown, keep the musculature moving, and it maintains glide and slide within the tissues, keeping them healthy. The moment we put stasis into the system, what we start to see is that the tissues start hardening a little bit more and muscular tissue starts diminishing. And what we look at is, you know, those dynamics and how that happens, and in fact, what goes on with the fascial tissues, and also some of the, you know, the newer findings within the fascial tissues have really told us a lot, especially with what we learned by this project working on Freya in Germany, because that was a team of body workers doing the dissection. So we learned a lot by understanding the tissue textures. And we could see where densification has happened. We could see where atrophy had happened and the effects of that on the body. And it's quite profound, much more so than we ever thought. Okay, I'm just going to continue on for another few minutes and then we'll bring it to a close. So here, based on what I was just describing, where you've got the tissue to the left, which is from someone that's had the limb broken, so it's still relatively sort of healthy fascial tissue, and then to the right where the tissue has come out of a plaster cast. Now with physiotherapy, they would maybe be able to get it to return to what it would have looked like on the image on the left, you know, with regular practice. Although, you know, we know this in the UK, and I think, is it 6 sessions now that hospital physios have?
Oh, some of them are down to 4.
Some of them down to 4. Now, when I used to lecture at the Sussex hospitals here to the physios, and they were doing 9 sessions, but complaining that 9 wasn't enough. So down to 4 is nowhere near enough for someone to actually progress. And also, you know, a lot of the general public don't know where to go to next. You know, so whatever country you're in, if you're a manual therapist, then, you know, make contact with these people. So, or make contact with the physios and the hospitals if you're a manual therapist that's involved in movement, but also in cranial work too. Can you help and become assistants to these if people can also afford it? But there's also all sorts of schemes where they get low-cost treatments and so on. Okay, moving on. So this is the thing, is fascia is not about where. We kind of know where it is. We also look at where it is anyway, but how is it? You know, so we start to explore the how of the fascial tissues rather than just where it is. So of course, being the living anatomy course that it is, we need to look at the where, but also as we go through each region, we start to look at the possible how of those tissues too, and the effect that that has. And you know, the last group that we had, I think we had up to about 40 people or so, wasn't it, Anne? Something like that. And each individual, including me, including Anne, including Michael, and whoever, is that we've all got a how about our tissue, and we understand how that feels as well, and that gives us a lot of feedback, and that's very important information. So coming back to this again, we can see from an illustration and then from a dissection that's been very well cleaned up, we can see some of the ligamentous material that's connecting those vertebrae to the ribs. And again, what we don't want that stuff to do is to densify, because if it densifies, then there's restriction to the movement of the thoracic spine and the restriction to the capacity for the breath. Here, we're looking at an image of the front of the spine. where we see the anterior ligament along the front of the spine. In fact, when we look at its fibers, it's very well organized, but we also find something very interesting underneath that tissue once it's dissected as well. But that's a lot to go into right now, but it's got a really interesting effect on the discs. But you can see how it blends itself outwards towards the rib structures and the joints for the rib structures. So here, and the reason I've got here, iliolumbar ligament. So if you can see my cursor, I can see Yvonne, I can see Micah. Can you see my cursor moving around? Yeah, okay, good. So if I circle here with the cursor, this area, and then you can see it here. Now, this is one of the models from the place in Germany that I've been doing all my dissection work with at the Placinarum. This is a placinated pelvis. You're looking at it from above. It's half the spine, cut down the sagittal plane. And over here, you can see a strong ligament, and that's present down here. And something that we see, especially in our dissections, is this ligament called the iliolumbar ligament that connects the 4th and 5th lumbar vertebrae laterally to the pelvis. We see these calcify or as calcified structures in our dissections. So what that suggests, and if I just come off the share.
What age, sorry, Gary, what age do you find them calcifying at?
Yeah, so they calcified, we've seen that from the age of 50 right the way up to about 90. Yeah, from level 50, let's correct myself, level 50 to level 90. So where we have the pelvic structure, this is L5. And when you look at L5, you can see L5 is actually within the confines of the pelvis. L4 is pretty much within the confines of the pelvis. And what you've got here, these, not the yellow bit, but the white bit, the sticky outy bits at the side, that's a technical term. We don't always use those technical terms. We use the other terms like transverse process. So running from those structures, if I can just hold this with my hands, you've got these ligaments that do this, and they connect to the sides of the transverse processes. Now, they're tough elastic material, so that when we're walking, the iliac bones, when we walk, those iliac bones do this just slightly. They're meant to do that. The pelvis isn't a fixed bowl. So when we move, those iliac bones do this. So can you imagine the effect that that's going to have then at this particular region? When the iliac bones are moving, then these structures are moving ever so slightly. So it creates a kind of a tensional recoil in the tissue. Does that make sense to everyone? But what we see is that it calcifies. And where it's calcified, it demonstrates that there's been load. And where there's been load, now that load could either be the head forwards, or that load could be the spine shortening. So there's different ways that load can reach those areas. So where it's calcified and densified, it means that L4 and L5, the 4th and 5th lumbar vertebra, are now pretty much fused with the pelvis. And it might as well be one big sacrum. If ever you buy yourself one of these plastic models, free with every plastic spine, you get a red bulging disc. Almost as if that's mandatory. And quite often it's here. Now I know it's a model and they're just demonstrating it, but here between L3 and L4, which is actually a common place that we see the issue. Which means that, as for example, if L4 and L5 and L4 are fixed a little more towards the pelvis, then this individual is having to put a lot more movement at one joint. And then between L3 and L4 becomes a platform for motion. And it's unlikely that the disc can sustain all of that load. Does that make sense? As a possible idea. So when we start to look at things through a fascial lens, we start to have a very different explanation for the anatomy. And it gives us a very different explanation as to maybe how movement patterns occur or not, and so on. So again, as we weave through the body, which we will be doing, and we do this from head to foot, from inside of bone out to skin. We look at the hormonal network or system. We look at the electrical quality to the system. And in fact, what being in gravity does to our electrochemical system. And for me, that's really quite profound as to how that works. And it's quite a stunning region of the body. And it's, I mean, that's beyond a whole weekend, but it's quite fascinating. But I'm going to wrap up there. There's a lot to keep going into, but I've got another 15 slides and I'll be going on till midnight, and you guys will be, well, midnight in the UK, and yeah, Anne's going, no, stop, don't do that. But I'll pass it back now to Anne, and maybe we can field some questions. Michael, pass it back to you. Hopefully this has been useful for everyone. It kind of gives you a bit of a flavor as to how the two of us interact together and the way that we start to teach, and the kind of, you know, it's a body story really that we're going through.
I must say I've learned so much from listening to how you teach and what you teach, because the fascia is part of, it was starting to be thought about, sort of, when I started my physio training many years ago, but nothing really in depth. And then about 20 years ago, I started to hear a bit more about it, but I've never done like a specific fascial course of any kind, but it's very, very interesting, completely different, not different, and adding on to how the whole body works, that is really helpful when you do hands-on work.
Yes, absolutely. And we have lots of images from the fascial net placidation projects of you know, placinated fascial structures that we've never seen before, and that kind of gives a lovely bedrock for the teaching as well. Michael.
Well, wonderful, Gary and Anna. I think you've given us just a beautiful taste and flavor of what's going to be an incredible journey and exploration through the body, and your love and your passion for the body and for its beautiful intelligence and its organization is absolutely infectious. So thank you so much. There's a few questions that have come into the chat box, which I can read out. From Mark, do you have any advice for beneficial daily habits that helped us to go from rest to hypervigilance?
From rest to hypervigilance, or is that from rest to hypervigilance and back again to rest?
Presumably what you're saying, presumably the return back to rest as well. In other words, that kind of adaptability that you're referring to.
Yeah, so I mean, there's an element actually is very good from what Anne did, you know, coming back to the breath where you can find the sides of the ribs and getting the breath into the lower portions of the back and sides of the body. The back and sides of the body is where you've got most lung tissue and diaphragm, in fact. So can we invite the breath to those regions, but also make sure that I always suggest that my students can, if they can lay on their back, or my clients can they lay on their back. And if they do lay on their back, if they've got the knees bent, feet wider than hip width, but toes turned in so the knees drop together, which actually relieves the waist into the ground and softens the tissue there, and then bring the breath there. So you've got two things happening. The breath is beginning to bring the system into more of a parasympathetic state, but by resting on the ground, there's that element of safety of the support of the ground. And that kind of takes us towards you know, the stuff that Stephen Porges is talking about in the polyvagal theory, where you need safety. Yeah, so that's one such area that you can start to consider. How do you meet the ground, and where's the breath? And they're two key elements to it, which is what the animal has. It's the ground and the breath, nothing more.
Mark also asks, how can one continue moving while not agitating the nervous system? I don't think you can, because it needs to be agitated to the point where it helps you to move and do the things you need to do to move. But there is an over agitation where you're irritated, and that is, I think, quite individual to the person about what would agitate one person would not agitate another person. That's down to how your whole nervous system is easily accessible to stimulate or to calm down.
Yes. Yeah, I think there's a point. There's another element to that as well. Where we see things like Qigong and Tai Chi practices, is that they teach a very fluid, flowing, very slow quality of motion. But Tai Chi, for instance, is considered to be the higher form of martial art. So that once those qualities of movement actually come into the system, you can make a movement very quickly because you've actually conditioned the body to do it. But you don't make a movement very quickly whilst being agitated. It actually comes from being in a calm state. So you have a better opportunity to respond to the environment. But also, being human is that sometimes we will go to that place where the nervous system becomes agitated with it. Do we then have the tools to be able to bring it back to dissipate? And as Anne rightly said, there's, for me to take action, sometimes my nervous system needs to be able to be charged a bit. But the difference, I think, is where is the right amount that we use? Or do we use too much? Or have we come from too little? There's a sweet spot for everything. And can we learn to understand that and feel that? And that purely takes practice.
Yeah.
And just get a question from Sati Katerina. Will the course mention also difference in living anatomy flow of male and female body and changes through the female cycles and pregnancy and postpartum?
No. I talk about the reproductive system, but just for us to name the anatomy, know how it sits or how it's connected via the nervous system, etc. But I'm not going to go into pregnancies and postpartum and that, because that is a whole seminar in itself.
There's elements that might come up in some of the sessions where we do look at the differences in terms of the way the tissues tend to lay down and organize themselves and how they're affected hormonally. And you start to see that starts to drop into, and it makes a lot of understanding for many people that have been on the past group. They can kind of relate it to what happens in those situations, and they take that information and then study further. But it gives them the right places as to where to look for that information as well.
There is a question also from Aliona, and maybe I can answer this question. Thank you for the brilliant webinar. Could you please recommend a book on embryology that can be used for understanding our movement patterns? I don't know, Gary, if you got one, but I think I have one, but I know the author. I can't remember the name of the book.
Yeah, well, I mean, this is the basics one that we know. That's a very simple basics one. I've got that up there if you can all see that. But understanding movement patterns from embryology, there's not a lot of work around that. It's a lot of it comes into seminars and webinars and so on. However, what we do look at, and this happens every single session, we always go back to the embryo in every single session that informs what we're about to teach. So there are some basic movement patterns that the embryo goes through just through its developmental stages that we then relate to movement, and that comes into the course. So it's not that we say, okay, this day we're doing that. It comes through the course as the course unfolds.
I remember doing some postgraduate courses in viscera that was all about the movements of the liver, the movements of the stomach, the movements of the large intestines, but that was a course in itself. Okay, Amos has just put out best embryology book for movement, Philip Beach, osteopath, muscles and
meridians.
Meridians, yeah.
Meridians, yes, that is a good book, actually. Well remembered. Thank you.
Okay.
Yeah.
I'm also going to name a relatively new book by Bonnie Bainbridge Cohen, who developed body-mind centering. I can't remember the name of the book, but it's a book that came out about a year or two which relates very much to movement practices and embryological origins.
Great.
So I think we're moving towards completion. Maybe this is just a little time now to wrap up. Gary, maybe you want to put up a couple of slides just to
I'll
let people know what comes next.
Okay, give me a second whilst you're...
Sure.
Thank you for your thank yous.
Okay. So here.
Great. So for those of you who are interested, one of the next steps that you can take is to join Gary and Anna on a foundation day. That's a full day of living anatomy exploration that's going to happen on May 22nd. The cost of that day is £50 if it's booked by the 22nd of April, or £65 if it's booked after that date. And it's a kind of a further, deeper taster. It's a foundation for what will take place on the Living Anatomy course. And if you then do decide that you want to join the Living Anatomy course, that begins on June 25th and 26th. As Gary and Anna mentioned, it's run over 9 live online weekends, spaced out around once a month. And if you do book on that foundation day as a taster, you would get the money that you've paid for that refunded. So that will be deducted from the cost of the full course. So if you do want to go further, you can either book on the whole lot, or if you just want to take one step and just check it out a little bit more before deciding whether you want to continue, you can just book on the single day. But then, as I say, the single day ends up being free if you do end up going further forwards. So I think I might just leave it to Gary and Anna just to wrap up and complete for the evening. And let's pass on to you both again, just to say any final words.
Well, thank you very much for joining, everybody. It's been another interesting evening. I hope you had as much fun as we did. I hope to see you again soon. And yeah, take you on a journey, or go on a journey together with me and Gary. It'll be interesting.
Yeah, we sort of hold your hands for a while, but then we let them go, because you're kind of free falling into your own body. And it's for me, it's forever inspiring, and it's always interesting. And you know, as you've probably understood, I do a lot of dissection, and I can't go into the dissection lab and think I know what I'm doing, because every time I go in there and do that, the body catches me out every single time. There's always something different that we learn, something new that we learn, and the research is constantly changing. So, in fact, I know this will happen given the course that we've just completed. New information is going to start laying into the coming course anyway, because we're pretty much, pardon the pun, on the cutting edge of that information that comes up. So, you know, we keep trying to weave it in, but also bringing it back to you so it can make sense of your own experience, and that you can't replace that. That's so important, to take it into your own experience. And we've seen some beautiful transformations that happen from that, and it keeps happening for us. You know, we keep learning in the process as well. So I know Anne and I have been through a lot. You know, every time you go through it, we go through it.
And if you expect to come and know everything by the end of the course, we will both disappoint you completely.
Yes.
We hope to inspire you and get you started on a journey and give you as many tools and informations as you can, but it will not be a fully ended I know everything by the end course. So therefore, there's also no pressure on you to know everything by the end of it. So yeah, I hope we'll go on a journey together.
Thank you, and thanks for all turning up from every part of the world.
So,
thank you from everywhere.
Also, just to kind of flag in, there's a couple of questions coming in I also want to just address before we go. Yes, each weekend is recorded, so You can, the video recordings will be available for people to catch up. If you miss a seminar, you can catch up with the live recordings. The live recordings are also available for review. There are also extensive course notes, home study. I should also say that the course is also accredited. It's accredited by the Federation of Holistic Therapists. So it is a beautiful way to learn anatomy and physiology, not in the normal, dry, two-dimensional way. You're going to learn it. You're going to learn the information, but you're also going to learn how to embody that information. So if you've any questions, just get in touch with Esther, our administrator. She'll be happy to help you. And just huge thanks to everybody for turning up tonight. And huge thanks to both Gary and Anna. Thank you so much for your wonderful talk, your knowledge, your inspiration, and just the experience that you ooze whenever you speak. It's a delight to listen to you. And thank you so much for sharing that.
Pleasure, pleasure, pleasure.
All right.
Great.
Jazz hands and goodbye, everybody.
Jazz hands.